Good evening, everybody. Great to be with you. I'm Dennis Nally, Chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers International. Thanks for joining this evening. Certainly, we all know that Davos is a pretty busy time for all of us, so delighted that so many of you could take the time and come with us this evening. And it's great to see so many old friends and some new faces as well. So, and let me give a special welcome to everyone joining us via the web. If you're watching on the internet, please do send your questions in as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end of today's presentation. Before we get into the survey results themselves, I'd like to thank the more than 1,400 CEOs from 83 countries, that's right, 1,400 CEOs from 83 countries who participated in our 19th annual Global CEO Survey. And in particular, the 33 who took some extra time out of their really busy schedules to join us and provide us with some really in-depth face-to-face interviews, which I think really gives some great color to the results. I'd also like to introduce our global leaders that are here with us tonight. Bob Moritz from the United States, Ian Powell from the UK, and Norbert Winkel-Johann from Germany. And they'll join me in answering questions that you may have at the end of the presentation. Before I answer your questions, I want to take you briefly through the survey highlights that we have. And if you're looking for what the CEOs are thinking at a local level, we actually have over 20, that's right, 20 specific cuts of the data by country. So a lot of detail that might be of interest to you. So let's get started. CEOs today are feeling a lot less optimistic than they did just a year ago. Whether it's the volatile Chinese markets, the rising political tensions around the world, the disruptive technologies that we're all aware of, CEOs see real challenges ahead, and this is reflected in how they view the prospect for the global economy. So here's the headline. 27% of the CEOs believe that the global economic growth will improve in 2016. And that's down a whole 10 points. That's right, 10 points from last year, and down from 44% in 2014. A 17-point decline when you look at the trends. But what's even more striking is that 23% of the CEOs believe that the economic growth in 2016 will actually decline. And this has risen from 17% just last year and 7% in 2014. Another great trend, right? So bottom line, the trends aren't good. And here's another point. We finished interviewing the CEOs in December. And my guess is that if we were to ask the CEOs today how they feel, the results could even be worse. Now, turning to confidence in their own revenues. The CEO's confidence in their own revenues is also on a decline. Take a look at here, 39, 35%. 2016, 35% of CEOs are very confident of their company's revenue growth in the year ahead. Again, down from 39% last year, and even below the levels we saw in 2013. So not a great trend line. But what is interesting when you think about it is that the CEOs are generally more confident about their own company's prospects than they are about the general economic picture that they're looking at. And this, we believe, is because they feel more confident about their own ability to navigate these challenging times. But as this graph shows, both are on the decline. Both are on the decline. So, many of us are looking for some bright spots here, right? Well, one bright spot is that CEOs are also still relatively confident about jobs, with about 48% of the CEOs planning to add headcount the year ahead, which is down only slightly from last year. The sectors hiring the most, technology, asset management, and the pharmaceutical sectors are the most positive about hiring in 2016. Now, when we look at the results by region, there's really some interesting changes compared to last year. Europe has gone from the least optimistic region to the second most optimistic this year, just behind Africa. In fact, it's only in Europe that we see CEOs expressing increased confidence in their 12-month revenue growth. However, in every other region, confidence is down, and sometimes markedly, by around 10 points in North America, as well as in Asia-Pac. And when you look at the Middle East here, confidence has actually fallen by 35 points in the last 2 years, clearly attributed to the current state of oil prices, as well as the geoeconomic and political climate that exists in the Middle East. Now, looking at individual countries, I have to admit that the picture is not all that much more cheerful. Let's go back to 2015. Last year, when you look at this chart, had a lot more green than we did red. But when you look at 2016, the picture is actually reversed, with virtually every major economy in the world showing a decline in confidence. And India bucks the trend here. Confidence is up from last year, and CEOs remain among the most confident in the world, clearly boosted by the positive view business has on the Modi government. And Spain has actually enjoyed the highest increase in confidence in the survey this year, up 19 points to 54%. The other country where confidence has recovered, albeit from a pretty dramatic fall last year, is Russia, where confidence has now risen to 26%. And Russia, to be fair, is by no means the least confident country in 2016. That dubious distinction goes to Switzerland, where confidence has dropped to 16%, largely due to the worries of the strength of the Swiss franc. Now, the caution around revenue growth has also driven the choices of which markets they see driving growth in the year ahead. The US remains ahead of China for the second year in a row, while the seemingly safer bets of Germany and the UK are in positions 3 and 4. There were also some changes lower down in the table, with Mexico and the UAE replacing Australia and Indonesia in the top 10. And what's interesting, while we saw that India CEO confidence was at a high level, this clearly has not translated into how the international community is thinking about investment for India in 2016. Now, when you look at some of the things that CEOs are worrying about, you begin to understand, I think, a little bit better why they're feeling really concerned. Interestingly, 2/3 of CEOs see more threats today in their business than they did just 3 years ago. Concerns about regulation, higher than ever before, now reaching 80% of the CEOs. And it's clear the regulatory pendulum is showing no sign of improvement. Also, the lack of key skills and exchange rate volatility continue to trouble CEOs. And with 74% of CEOs citing geopolitical uncertainty, this has risen to the second most worrying issue. And given recent events, it's likely to become even more pronounced in the year ahead. And to me, what's really interesting about this, geopolitical issues weren't even cited 3 or 4 years ago. And now it's the number 2 threat for CEOs as they think about the future. So it's fair to say CEOs have a lot on their minds. But it's not just the issues that they can try to address, such as lack of skills or cybersecurity, for example. It's also the major economic as well as the political events like currency volatility and terrorism over which they have no control. So with that, let me try and complete the picture of what's really darkening the mood of CEOs today. They actually see a rapidly changing world which is becoming increasingly divergent. And apart from the internet access, CEOs see a world growing further apart on key issues such as economic models, trading blocks, rule of law and values, as well as belief systems. And this all adds up to a really complex environment through which CEOs must continue to navigate their organizations. And they are just doing that, looking beyond the real disruptive short term to ensure their organizations are actually successful for the longer term. Now, when we talk about what the CEOs are focused on, they told us they're looking at 3 priorities to really sustain value. First, and I think really interesting, CEOs have recognized they need to address greater stakeholder expectations, particularly around the customer. In a significant change to the survey that we did this year, we inquired of CEOs about how they're responding to the increasing demands of various stakeholders, whether it be customers, investors, regulators, or for that matter, society in general. And not surprisingly, given the lack of trust which exists today, more and more CEOs are being challenged about why their organization exists. As a result, CEOs are placing a values-based purpose at the center of their organization, not only just to deepen stakeholder relationships, but also to increase growth while having a broader impact on society. And this is one of the reasons that PwC recently entered into a long-term strategic partnership with the leading values-based consulting firm, LRN. LRN is going to work with PwC and our clients to build the right values-based culture for success. And Dov Seidman, the founder of LRN, is here with us tonight. Dov, welcome. Thank you. Second, CEOs understand all too well that technology is transforming their relationships with all stakeholders. The challenge is to use technology to better interpret the complex and evolving needs of customers in order to better engage with them. So where are they focused? 9 out of 10, that's right, 9 out of 10 CEOs say that they're changing how they use technology to assess customer and wider stakeholder expectations and deliver against them. And the third priority CEOs are focused on is reporting and communicating a broader measure of success. Very interesting, 3/4 of the CEOs agree that success is going to be defined by more than just financial performance. They want better measures on how innovation and risk impact profitability. And at the same time, they've selected some of the softer drivers of success, such as values and purpose, which they want to do more communicating around. The challenge, quite frankly, is to better measure, to better communicate both the harder as well as the softer drivers of business success. So to conclude, CEOs are clearly dealing with a lot of moving parts, an economic picture that is increasingly unpredictable, a world that in many ways is becoming more complex and disconnected, a series of risks that are growing wider, and a growing need to place a values-based purpose at the organization's center. And finally, a continuing technology revolution that is disrupting the very nature of business and, for that matter, society in general. So it's not a surprise that CEOs are really concerned about the next 12 months. So given these survey results and the challenges that CEOs face, certainly on a number of different fronts, it's easy for all of us to assume a doom and gloom scenario. But we see much more than that. To me, it's actually encouraging to see how CEOs are actually confronting today's realities, but also thinking about the long term, looking at how their business meets the broader needs of society and how the expectations of a wider group of shareholders can be met. And I also think that by focusing on meeting the greater needs of stakeholders, not just shareholders, the current level of trust in business can begin to get reestablished. And that trust, all of us, is an increasingly vital currency, particularly given all the uncertainties I've outlined here today. So these are the highlights of our 19th annual Global CEO Survey. There's a lot more detail on what CEOs think in the full report. Thanks for the attention, and particularly to those of you that are on the web. And do send in your questions right now, and we'll open it up for questions. Thanks again. How about the first question? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Supriya Srinatha. I represent ET Now, the Times of India group channel in India. There is a divergent view that's coming. You're saying CEOs are less confident about their own growth, the economic growth, and yet they're confident about adding more jobs. Isn't that an oxymoron?
Well, I think what they're really saying is that they're confident about their own company's ability to navigate these challenging times, and doing so, they're essentially keeping their job levels or employment levels flat, for the most part. I mean, if you compare it to where it was a year ago. So it's not a positive message about jobs. If it's positive that things are holding flat or constant, that would be the takeaway from that standpoint. But I still think it's a pretty challenging environment. And again, I think you have to look at this almost by sector basis, because there are a lot of variances when you start to look at it from that angle. Yeah.
Thank you. Frank Kane from the national newspaper, Abu Dhabi, UAE. You say that geopolitical concerns are rising. They are the number 2 interest now. The number 2 concern now. But that's a wide category. Did you get any feedback from CEOs on what in particular they are concerned about in the global scene?
Well, I think, again, it would vary dependent upon, what part of the world you're talking about. But the category of geopolitical concerns, cuts across the whole of the world. In other words, what CEOs are really talking about are the crises over the last year that are continuing. It could be Russia, Ukraine. It could be, obviously, the issues in the Middle East that we're all familiar about. It could be China, as well as Taiwan, Japan. Just about all parts of the world have hotspots, is the way I would describe it. You might even reference the impact of the migrant crisis right here in Europe in terms of how that's playing out and affecting the environment here in Europe. And the point that CEOs are making, regardless of the specific, the point they're really making is these issues are well beyond their control, which is creating uncertainty for them. And as they think about their business, they think about where to make investments, how to plan for the future. It's just one more uncertainty that they have to deal with. And again, I mentioned this in my remarks. What's really interesting to me is this whole issue about the geopolitical environment and the risk associated with that showed up for the very first time last year. And so, and now it's the number 2 item in terms of a threat that the CEOs are really focused on. I think it's clearly having, the impact on confidence in terms of their abilities to look at the global economy and the implications to that, as well as what that really means to their own individual business. Let me go to a question to the web if I could, and we'll make sure we get a lot of questions out here. Bob, I think this is for you. Why has U.S. CEO confidence dropped so much? Bob heads up our U.S. practice, and he's the right person to answer that question.
Sure, thanks, Dennis. As you'll see in the statistics, the U.S. CEO confidence level dropped from about a 46% confidence level down to 33%. So let's put it all in perspective. When you look, it still is a place to be investing when it ends up being the number 1 area around the world. Having said that, I'd say there's probably 4 different drivers of why that confidence has come down. Number 1, the U.S. connectivity to the rest of the world. Even though we've fragmented, the emerging markets in particular, and that slowdown clearly has had a negative implication in terms of how the U.S. economy has supplied the world with exports in terms of the opportunities there. I think there's a counterbalance to that in terms of the energy space, where you've seen the price of oil have a negative implication in terms of job creation, for example, down in Texas, and the supply chain that comes in it. So I think that first piece is really important. Second, the amount of change that Dennis talked about earlier is huge. And this is where CEOs are struggling with how much change can I keep up with? Where can I make those investments? So that uncertainty is playing a huge part in their mindset in terms of where they invest, how much they invest in, and how big they should be investing. The third thing I would focus on is technology. The combination, and one of the themes coming out of Davos this year with the fourth industrial revolution around the implications of technology, digitization, is causing massive change. Business models are changing. How many people do I really need to hire, which goes back to where they are hiring, is really disruptive, and people are struggling to keep up. And last but not least is obviously the politics. You've got a unique political environment right now that's a free-for-all, clearly entertaining nonetheless, but nonetheless a free-for-all, and that uncertainty in terms of whether a new president will come in and be able to galvanize the country and its political system to actually get changes that'll be beneficial from an economics perspective, a business perspective, is clearly a concern. So the combination of all these things is actually putting uncertainty in the minds of the CEOs, and I can tell you anecdotally, many of them are holding back in terms of how much investment they want to put forth today and where they want to put it.
So. Great summary, Bob. And I think what's really interesting, just to emphasize a point, when you look at where CEOs are saying they want to invest in 2016, notwithstanding the environment that Bob just described in terms of how the U.S. CEOs are feeling, the rest of the world is still looking at the U.S. as being the number one destination point from an investment standpoint. So it's almost like, what do the U.S. CEOs know that the rest of the world doesn't know about, is sort of what you have to sort of get around in your mind. But it's a really interesting potential disconnect, is the way I'd put it. Let's go in the back of the room there. Yeah.
Larry Elliott of The Guardian. You've been doing this survey for quite a long time. What sort of predictive capacity does it have? Did the survey pick up the downturn in 2008-9 and the recovery thereafter? And should we therefore read anything into the fact that CEOs are gloomy now, or does it have no predictive qualities whatsoever?
I think it's got a reasonable degree of predictability, is the way I'd put it. In other words, if you're looking at absolutes, the answer is no, because it's a pretty diverse, when you think about 1,400 CEOs in the survey results. But the trends that are there, if you go back over a period of time, they're very consistent in terms of the peaks and the valleys, is the way I describe it. I think you can take this as an indicator as to what you can expect to see from a performance perspective in 2016. Yeah, let's go over here. Could you wait? Let's get a mic. Yeah.
Hey, Peter Goodman with the International Business Times. Can you give us more detail on this surprising shift in Europe toward more optimism? Is this more sort of moderation of things CEOs were worrying about a year ago, or truly optimism? What are they seeing?
Norbert, Ian, you want to take it? Either one.
I think
maybe both.
Probably I could start.
You start.
There are some obvious reasons. Yeah, on one hand, low interest rates. The other thing is low oil prices. Then, in the meantime, my impression is that the economy and the whole business people have, are really used to a flexible business world. So they realize that there's probably not enough business opportunity in Brazil or in Russia, but there are now new, since Sunday, probably opportunities in Iran. So I think this together gives really a positive outlook. But Ian?
Yeah, sure. And in addition, I'd say that some of those countries that have had really difficult times, like Spain has seen one of the biggest increases in confidence right the way through this survey for this last 12 months. So you start feeling that Spain is coming back. You've got European businesses that look to the US, to pick up on Bob's point earlier as well, look to the US for confidence and doing a lot of trade with the US as well. And there's that general feeling, if you look at the overall growth rates in the economies across Europe, there's been a bit of an upward trend. I suspect part of this is that it's been so bad for so long, there is now a much more positive feeling out there. And CEOs feel that they can take the opportunities that are now presented to them. Just very quickly from a UK perspective as well, I think you saw that, I think it was 39% last year, CEOs were very confident of revenue growth in the next 12 months. This year that dropped to 33%. Having said that, when you look at the overall confidence, I think it was about 85% of CEOs last year saw that they were still fairly confident, and that is still only at about 84%, so that hasn't moved a lot. You also see in the UK that one of the biggest issues is going to be around talent. In the UK, we've got the highest levels of employment for many, many years. And also we've got the highest level of vacancies as well. So the thing that really seems to be attracting the attention of UK CEOs is how do we fill that talent gap, both by investing in the people that we've got inside our business, by recruiting people in as well. And that is going to get incredibly tight if the growth does continue to come through, which is why a lot of UK CEOs, I think something like 95%, are looking across at technology as well as being one of the principal areas that they see as being pretty fundamental to the change in their business in the coming years. That is probably going to be where a lot of investment will go to try to address that skills gap.
While we have you up here, Ian, we got a question right up here on the screen. The impact on the EU that the referendum in the UK is going to have on confidence. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess I'd say, I mean, ultimately the British people are going to weigh up all the different arguments on this. British business at the moment is fairly confident, as you could see. But I guess any uncertainty really sort of does start to damage confidence in the longer run. So British business at the moment, I guess, is looking to see what are the negotiations, how are the negotiations going to go, and then I guess it'll address those issues as they come through and reevaluate them as what are the implications for their own business. So that is likely to increase in the coming months, and I would imagine that that will have some sort of impact on confidence going forward. But it's really to do with the uncertainty rather than, if you like, the politics of it.
Great, thanks. We had a question on the web. What is the PwC view about China? And I think it's a great question given the numbers that came out this morning. From a PwC perspective, we continue to be very strong on China from a longer-term standpoint. I think everybody is talking about the slowdown in growth in China. One of the worst performances from a quarter standpoint in over 30, 35 years. Let's be real here. This is still a tremendous, economy. It's got a lot of potential. And whether it's growing at 6.9%, 6.4%, 7.1%, that's still pretty impressive performance when you think about it. I think you have to acknowledge the fact that this is an economy that clearly is in transition. We all know that. The government's been very clear about what they have to do to move from an export-driven economy to a consumption-based economy. We actually do believe that you're going to continue to see bumps along the road here, as they make that transition. There's no, silver bullet here in this process, and so I think you have to expect that. So, we would say that if you thought China was a great long-term investment 12 months ago, not a lot has changed. It still has tremendous potential. Challenges, yes, but tremendous potential, and so we're still optimistic about the long-term potential for that economy vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
What is your growth potential for China, or your growth forecast for China? Do you have a number?
We would have it right in the 6.3 to 6.5% for 2016, which is a little lower than where the government is. Yeah, question?
Angela from Sina, China. And you just mentioned the expectation of China from the PwC's viewpoint, and I checked the highlights of China, and when the Chinese CEOs, when they took the survey, they didn't mention the stock market dropping down is a big threat for their business, but it's really made the headline for a couple of months and continue to be dropping until now. So what do you think of that? And also because of the exchange, the stock market turmoil in US as well, we can see some people in China, they will say we will suffer from another financial crisis as strong as 2008. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
Look, I think when you pull the survey results apart, the confidence levels of the CEOs this year versus last year is down in a very significant way, and it speaks to some of the issues that you alluded to, whether what was going on in the stock market, what was happening with currency, and I think it just indicates that as this economy transitions and goes through this transition period, you're going to continue to have those types of challenges that are going to have to be met, and some are going to be met in an easier way, a more straightforward way than maybe some of the others. And I think that's what's creeping into, the whole issues around confidence. The government there, as you well know, they're doing things that, quite frankly, there's no playbook for, right, in terms of how to make this transition. And so I think you're going to have to, I think you should expect and assume that you're going to see, more volatility. And when you see volatility or instability, whichever word you want to use there, business leaders, that impacts their confidence levels. And I think that's the way you got to look at it. But having said that, does that change the outlook from a long-term economic opportunity perspective? We would say no. And quite frankly, it still is the number 2 destination for investment for CEOs from around the world. So we shouldn't ignore that either, notwithstanding some of the challenges that exist there. So I don't think it has to be all gloom and doom. I think you have to have a realistic view about what that economy is going through from a transformation or transition standpoint. Yeah, question. Get a mic, please.
Francis Matthew of Gulf News in Dubai. I'd like to ask about India, where you say that 64% of the CEOs are optimistic, and yet from international CEOs, only 9% see much. Who's missing what?
Well, I think it's a tale of two woes. I think if you're in India today, you're incredibly positive about the initiatives that have been announced by the Modi government. You're starting to see some real reforms being enacted. It's early days. And I think that's what's driving a lot of the confidence from a CEO standpoint in India. I think the international community is sitting on the sidelines at this point. I think they're positive towards what has been announced with the Modi government. I think they want to wait and see whether or not those reforms can actually be affected. So whether it's regulatory reforms, streamlining investment potential opportunities, rule of law, dealing with corruption or other issues that are of concern to investors coming into India. So I think it's wanting to see some of the playbook actually getting implemented and executed, and that begins to explain the potential disconnect here. Next year, I would like to see whether or not that gap is closed. If it isn't, I think we'll have another type of explanation for you. Okay. Question over here.
David Sirota with International Business Times. I'm just curious, what specific policies do you think CEOs are worried about coming up potentially in the United States? And do you think the tenor of the presidential election, specifically with calls for various crackdowns on corporate America, is germane to the results that you've seen in this study?
Well, Bob will chime in here, but the number one issue we have not talked about yet here this evening is the concerns that CEOs have about regulation today. 80% of the CEOs cite that as the number one issue that they're most concerned about. Now, we've talked about a lot of things here tonight, but when you think about where that regulatory pendulum is today versus where it could have been post the financial crisis, I think you see many business leaders from around the world that are still very much concerned that the regulatory reforms are still being enacted. There's still uncertainty with regard to how some of these rules, regulations are going to play out. And if you're an MNC doing business in multiple countries, a lot of inconsistency in one part of the world versus the other. That's adding costs, it's adding complexity, and it's certainly having an impact on how CEOs think about confidence from an investment standpoint. So the regulatory environment is one that I think continues to be a challenge for the international community as you think about that. And I think there's got to be more work that's done to understand the impact of some of these regulations that have been put in place, many rightly so post the financial crisis, as to the cause and effect and whether or not they're fit for purpose in terms of a growth agenda. And I think that's one of the things that governments, business, and regulators need to work hand in hand with to really answer. But maybe Bob, other comments?
Yeah, so let me break it into a couple of buckets for you. I think the regulatory environment, broadly speaking, is a challenge, and it comes in three forms. It comes in the form of what's the additional cost to comply with the new regulations that have put on the books over the last couple of years. It goes to the uncertainty of what new regulations may be coming, and obviously that does play into the primaries that have been started already in terms of which political position is being staked out and how far they'll go. Obviously, one of the Democratic candidates putting out a big bravado around breaking up the banks and the like is another implication associated with that. And then the third is old laws but newly interpreted, right? So you've got a legal system that's interpreting things in a different way, which organizations struggle with. I think I'd go to the other side. So taxation is another one that's out there. Everybody sees the combination of the tax laws in the U.S. Are they competitive enough? And again, the political aspirations in terms of which approach is another issue that's it's focused on. You go to a third bucket, the cost of healthcare. And again, I think this is where politics come in. And then I'm going to throw another one, which is, I'll call it the geopolitical aspects. If it's going to be a foreign exchange war, if you look at some of the variability that's happened over the last couple of years with volatility, and that's going to be problematic. If you think about cap and trade issues that might be coming up as you look at some of the political positions that have been staked out. So I think all of that does have an implication on where we are today. And that's why I was in my fourth bucket earlier when I talked about the implications of the political process right now, both in terms of what's being said by those candidates and their ability to lead in bringing not only the White House, but Congress and Senate all together to actually provide a little bit more certainty for the business community to think about what they should do, how they should invest to maximize their opportunities that are out there for them.
Thanks, Bob. We got a question from the web. Are you surprised about the pessimism in Switzerland? Being in Switzerland, we should answer that question. The good news is we have the leader of our Swiss practice here. Urs, why don't you come up and take that question for us?
Thanks, Dennis. No, we were not really surprised by the results, I have to say. Because as you might know, last year when we did the survey, this was before the 15th of January 2015, when the Swiss franc has been strengthened by up to 20%. So we are now down from 24 to 16 short term, but long term we have seen an increase even when we ask the CEOs, so from 31 to 38. So we believe it is more around this strengthening of the Swiss francs, and there's some other challenges we do have here in Switzerland. One is tax. We are in the middle of a tax reform, and so this is an uncertainty which is not good for the optimism of CEOs.
So no surprise.
No surprise.
Other questions? Going back here. We get a mic here? Yeah, thanks.
My name is Teranishi from Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. Could you give me a bit more comment on the low oil price? For example, in Japan, we import a lot of oil from Middle East, so the low oil price would be benefit for the Japanese business. But in the other parts, in the global, maybe the low oil price with a negative impact. So how do you see the CEOs, this low oil price on the global economy? And would you also give me your PwC views on low oil price, please?
So I'm not going to give you any views about what the price of oil might go to, because if I could do that, I probably wouldn't be in this business that I'm in. However, the oil issue is exactly the way you explained it, which is dependent upon whether you're, consuming energy. That's a tremendous plus. It's a tremendous benefit, right, in terms of your cost structure and your ability to be more competitive. And that was one of the points that Norbert made as it relates to Europe. That's one of the positives, that exist here, in this part of the world. Obviously, it's having a very dramatic effect on those companies that are actually the ones that are producing energy. And you're beginning to see, more and more companies struggle with that. Over the last couple of weeks, you saw a number of significant mega projects put on hold, discontinued, because of where the price of oil is, and presumably a prediction that, at least from their perspective, there's the potential for energy to be even lower, and therefore the cost benefit of some of these projects is now into question. So I think it really is dependent upon from what chair you sit in as to whether or not you see this as a real plus or a minus. I think the other thing that, quite frankly, has not been factored in is with Iran now and the sanctions being lifted, the impact that could have on the price of oil as many more supply of oil comes into the marketplace. And I think that's going to be a dynamic that many are going to be watching here over the next several months as these sanctions get lifted. Other questions? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about this rising focus of the CEOs on values and purpose? How strong is your data on that point? How many of them are we talking about, and what do you think's driving it?
It's a great question. It's to us, we started to get a feel for this as a topic last year, but not in a real structured, substantive way. And as I mentioned in my remarks, this year we intentionally made a number of changes to the CEO survey to really try to get at that question. The whole issue around purpose, the whole issue around why institutions exist, how are they thinking about their role in terms of a broader group of stakeholders. And quite frankly, it stems from a view that we have at PwC that with the lack of trust that exists today in business and society, sooner or later you have to begin to figure out how to regain that trust. And I think what you're now seeing is a number of businesses that are taking a much broader view around their role, their responsibilities to society. It's early days is the way I would describe it. But it's really interesting to see in the report itself the number of CEOs that either have made changes or are going to make changes to why their institutions exist, how they're thinking about the greater contribution to society, which gets into a much more interesting way to think about regaining trust, if you will. So more measures, more metrics, more disclosures, more transparency. Early days, that's one of the reasons why we have associated with LRN in this process. We think this is the way that business does need to be conducted into the future. We certainly believe that at PwC, and we're on that journey ourselves. But a values-based culture that can really demonstrate much more to society is the way that we think business itself can regain the trust that's been lost over the past several years. So I would say more to come on it, early days, but I'm actually encouraged by the thinking that's gone into this from a CEO standpoint. We hope to have this as a prominent part of the discussion that we have in the next year's survey as well.
Yeah, it's just a quick one on that as well. I think when you actually go through the document, you'll see a lot of the quotes from the CEOs that were interviewed are very much around the values side of this. And I think, something like 67% of CEOs this year see this as absolutely fundamental to their business. And that is a massive shift from, 3-4 years ago. So I think CEOs are realizing that if you're going to have a sustainable business going forward, you really need to be on, what is the contribution that your business makes to society? And are the people that work for you and the people you want to work with, are their values aligned with the values that you are putting out there in terms of the organization as well? But Bob, do you want to say a few words as well?
Alan, it's a great question. Let's come at it from two perspectives. As you look at the CEO survey, while talent as a relative issue has dropped, it's relative. It's still a high risk in terms of the CEOs worrying about having the right access to talent. And if you were to listen to the next generation millennials, the reality is they will want more values matched in terms of what they expect beyond the bottom line compared to what their employer actually gives them. And in fact, if they don't see that match, they're more likely to walk. So the bias of sticking around is not as strong as perhaps a baby boomer or others like that. Now, switch gears. As you think about the consumer being much more well-informed with more information through technology and some of the mega trends that we've talked about in past years, will now start to, not necessarily right away, but over time, be spending more time talking about and thinking about the choices they make. Today, in the short term, it's all focused on sort of cost, efficiency, quality of that product. We predict, and the CEOs actually have indicated, that in the next 3 to 5 years, consumers will be making choices more on the value proposition of the organization as well. So it's a combination of the skills and access to it, as well as the connectivity for longevity relevant to the relationship that they have with consumers. And I think that becomes very important, and that's why you're seeing a bigger trend in this regard right now.
I think the one statistic that I think is really compelling to me is the question that was asked about the degree of focus that CEOs have on financial results and profitability, and the number of CEOs that basically are saying, yeah, that's important, but there's a lot more other important things that need to be focused on, not just for the short term, for the longer term. That's an interesting shift, the way I think about it, in terms of how this could potentially play out. So we'll see. We got a question here from the web. What priority did the CEOs give to innovation programs in their organizations? Obviously, this is right at the top. They talk about the technology revolution that we've all aware of. the need to innovate, the need to introduce creativity into their organizations, is one of the top priorities that they are in fact focused on. And to me, what was really interesting, we talked about changes in reporting and new measures. They actually cite the whole issue of innovation and creativity as one of those metrics that they want to have more disclosure around to evaluate how effectiveness many of these programs are. So it's clearly a topic that's getting a lot of focus, a lot of attention within all organizations.
Hey, Dennis, there's another way to answer that question, which is if you look at some of the other questions that came up in the survey, it pinpoints to the level of focus they have on innovation. So acquisitions. So yes, people are doing some acquisitions. You can look at the U.S. in terms of the opportunities for more domestic M&A. It's not necessarily just to create market share or demand. It's actually to gather IP. So getting an innovation mindset from other organizations is usually important. The other statistic that's out there, and you'll see it in the CEO survey, is how many organizations are interested in more alliances. So again, they're trying to bring together ecosystems of organizations to find more innovative ideas that come through. So it's not necessarily just the programs they put in place, it's a different business model to find an innovation for the benefit of long term.
Maybe one more question here. Yeah.
Okay. You are part of the global tax evasion business. Where do you see your own role in regaining trust?
Well, I tell you, we see that we have a really important role to play, with regard to that topic. We have spent a lot of time within PwC over the last several years thinking about some of the questions that have been asked here this evening. What is the purpose of our organization? Why are we here, and what are we trying to get accomplished? And we actually do believe we have a very important role to play with the whole trust agenda in terms of how you regain trust in society. Not only with how we advise our clients, with what they're doing, but importantly, what we can do to really help and drive that part of the agenda itself. So you'll see more transparency. You'll see the firm making decisions about what services we provide versus what we don't provide. So we think, given our history, given our legacy, this is a very important part of who we are in the past, but who we need to be as well in the future to facilitate that conversation. So a very important part of PwC.
I mean, just to rebut the statement, PwC is not in the tax evasion business. I mean, PwC, the vast majority of what we do is actually help people interpret all those complex rules around the world and make sure that our clients do actually pay the right amounts of tax as well. But, it's also, as Dennis said, absolutely fundamental to a firm like PwC that we're trusted and we have to behave in the right way, which we've got the right code of conduct, if you like, in terms of the way that we deal with tax. So the last thing I'd say on this as well is, I think there's a political element to this as well. As long as any countries are using tax rates to try to encourage people to invest in their countries or bring jobs in or inward investment, you will see an element of tax arbitrage. So I think a firm like PwC wants to engage at that political level as well to see what we can do together to remove that barrier so that, we do actually, create trust amongst the people right the way across the countries that we all operate in.
It's really an interesting question in the sense that, we don't have one global tax system, right, as we all know. Individual countries, as Ian just said, have put tax systems in place to encourage investment, to encourage job creation. And that's just a reality of the system that, has been deployed for many years. I mean, our first and foremost requirement is to make sure that every one of our clients is in compliance with those tax rules and regulations. The second part, though, goes towards when you think about the greater societal issues associated with that, are our clients really thinking about the broader impact of their decisions in terms of what their responsibilities are to meet a broader group of stakeholders? And we have a responsibility to at least engage with our clients along those lines as well. And that's the part of the equation that I talk about in terms of helping to regain trust, a very important part of what we can do, the role that we can play in that regard. Okay, so thank you for your questions this evening. Thanks for coming out, much appreciated. And for those on the web, thanks for joining. As always, great to be with you this evening. Thank you.